we're filming.
Okay, we have a couple of business things to take care of first. There will be a reception after this event if anyone is interested in hanging out. There will be some snacks. If you would like anything to drink, you should bring it with you. And that will be at Michael Principe's house. And if you need directions, you can ask any number of us for directions. In fact, anyone who can give directions to people, can you do one of these? Yeah, okay, good. And also, this event is being put on by the Middle Tennessee branch of Solidarity. And our open house is a week from today, from 3 to 5 in the nursing building, room 116. I think Jay's probably handed everyone a handbill about that. But if you need one, they're on the table over here. And also, UCW, CWA, which is the faculty and staff union here on campus, is having a teach-in, The Real Economy of MTSU. That will be on October 24th at 5 o'clock in this building, right down the hall, 334. And if you would like a flyer for that, we also have those on the table. So this is Charlie Post. He is a professor of sociology at City University of New York, and he's a member of Solidarity. And he's going to be talking about his book, The American Road to Capitalism, which was shortlisted for the Deutscher Prize in 2011. So I'm going to turn it over.
Okay, I'm going to sit here if that's okay with folks. Okay, makes it a little less formal. In many ways, it's quite appropriate, politically and intellectually, to be talking about a book on the origins of capitalism in the United States. At a moment when we're starting to see in the last year or so the revival of movements that, to one extent or another, consciously or not, challenge the present phase of neoliberal capitalism. We've seen the movement of the Indignados in Europe, we've seen Occupy in the US, we've seen waves of strikes and labor struggles, etc. And so the reason I think it's appropriate to be talking about a book on the origins of capitalism is that if we understand that capitalism actually has a history, that it is the product of historically contingent developments, that it is not the inevitable outcome of millennia-old processes, whether those be the growth of markets since the 10,000 years ago, or improvements to labor productivity through better tools and machinery. If capitalism is not the inevitable result of these long-term transhistorical processes, but instead is the product of specific contingent struggles between groups of human beings defined by their relation to each other and to nature through the production of goods and services, then we can imagine, if capitalism has a history, then we can imagine a possible, although not inevitable, end to capitalism. Now, my book is actually a collection of essays that I've written over the last 30-odd years, which grew out of my dissatisfaction with both the existing mainstream and Marxian analyses of the origins and impact of the US Civil War. The last comprehensive, synthetic, social interpretation of the US Civil War, an interpretation that saw the war as the result of deeply seated social and economic transformations of US society, was put forward in 1927 by the two prominent American historians, Charles and Mary Beard, in a book called The Rise of American Civilization. And the Beards basically argued that the growth of commerce, by which they included trade, manufacturing, etc., created increasing tensions in the early 19th century United States between what they defined as a business interest, made up of merchants, bankers, manufacturers, etc., and an agrarian interest, in which they included both family farmers in the northern United States and slaveholding planters in the South. They argued that the ability of the business bloc to divide the agrarian bloc in the 1840s and 50s, winning the support of northern farmers for the Republican Party, set the stage for the Civil War which led to, in their framework, the victory of business over agriculture. Now, the Beard's thesis by the 1940s was under very, very severe criticism by historians. And it was under severe criticisms not so much for its conceptual framework, which is, I'd argue from a Marxian viewpoint, problematic, but it was under criticism because it was empirically and factually wrong. Their notion that there were basically homogeneous, unified business interests versus unified agrarian interests were contradicted by a whole variety of research that showed real tensions among so-called business people, between merchants and bankers on the one hand and manufacturers on the other, over issues like protective tariffs, the expansion of slavery, and that there was also growing, sharpening differences among the agriculturalists, between family farmers in the north and slaveholding planters in the south, over issues of the redistribution of public lands in the U.S., what became known as the Homestead Law, the demand for the free distribution of land to actual settlers, and there were deep divisions going back to the early 19th century over the existence and spread of slavery. Now the problem was that as the Beard's thesis was being discredited among historians, what took its place was not a new, better grounded, more historically grounded, and more theoretically sophisticated social and economic interpretation of the war, but it was replaced by basically two non-social interpretations. On the one hand, there were the so-called revisionists. In the wake of the Second World War, a group of historians emerged who, because of their experience of the Second World War and the tremendous destruction of human life, etc., that the war had brought, they came to believe that the war was the result of manipulative, demagogic politicians, a blundering generation of political leaders in both the North and South who made the issue of slavery and its expansion, which really wasn't a real issue, according to these historians, a central issue dividing the nationally organized Democratic and Whig political parties and leading to what should have been an avoidable conflict and an avoidable civil war. The other non-social interpretation of the Civil War that emerges among mainstream historians in the 1950s and 60s is influenced by mainstream U.S. political science. By the 1950s and 60s, mainstream political scientists basically argued that social class, by which they meant income groups, really didn't have any impact or importance in U.S. politics. What made U.S. politics unique was the impact of ethno-religious conflicts. And for them, the Civil War was the unintended result of ethno-religious conflicts that developed in the 1840s and 50s. As the result of the first massive wave of immigration of Irish Catholics to the U.S., this creates tensions between native-born Protestant, Scotch, English, Irish earlier settlers, which creates tremendous tensions, particularly in both the Whig and Democratic parties, the two main establishment political parties of the 1830s and 1840s, leading eventually to a split in the Whig Party in the 1850s over the question of whether or not to grant citizenship rights and the right to vote to these new, foreign, un-American, and as many new historians are saying, immigrants who were perceived as non-white before the Civil War. This destroys the Whig Party, opens the road for the emergence of the Republicans, who, although they did not campaign on questions of immigration restriction, in the wake of the collapse of these national parties, which had maintained the unity of the national state, with the collapse of these parties, we get this, again, avoidable civil war. In the 1960s and 1970s, as a result of the revival of left politics because of the mass struggles of that era, against racism, against the war in Vietnam, the emergent wildcat strikes in the late 60s and early 70s, there emerges new layers of historians in the 60s and 70s who are attracted to Marxism. Now, the problem with this new Marxist historiography, people like Eugene Genovese, who writes extensively on slavery, Eric Foner, who becomes probably the most prominent US historian, who writes extensively on the Republican Party, the origins of the Civil War, etc. And they are all influenced to one extent or another by the historical sociologist Barrington Moore, who wrote a very famous book in the mid-60s called The Social Origins of Democracy and Dictatorship. And what they all argue is that the war was the result of a conflict over free labor versus slavery. That the two economic systems that were developing in the United States in the early 19th century, the free labor system, capitalist manufacturing, family farming in the North, and the plantation slave system in the South, were in fact incompatible. But they were not economically incompatible, they were politically and ideologically incompatible. That they produced different visions of what a good society was, and different visions of what a good state, a good political system was. And that these conflicts over the meaning of the republic, the meaning of democracy, the meaning of freedom, is what propelled the Civil War. Now, I found this argument problematic on two grounds. The first is that it tends to see ideological and political conflicts divorced from contradictions and conflicts rooted in the way people organize social production, I find is a problematic argument. But in particular for the US, the problem is this. The political and ideological conflicts, the Southern critique of free labor society, the Northern critique of slavery, were, for the most part, fully formed by the 1820s and 1830s. If you read it, as I did when I wrote my doctoral dissertation, you read the congressional debates on the admission of Missouri to the Union in 1820-21 as a slave state. All the main themes of the debates about why free labor is good or bad, why slavery is good or bad, all those arguments are made in the 1820s and 1830s. Yet, from the 1821 until the mid-1840s, the question of slavery and its existence and expansion is kept off the national political stage, and other issues and parties that organize both in the North and South are able to maintain political peace and maintain the unity of the US state until the 1840s. So if the conflict was purely political and ideological, why don't we see the political crisis that leads to the Civil War 20 or 30 years earlier? Because all those political and ideological questions were being debated. So what I tried to do in this book, in these essays over the last 20, 30 years, is that I came to believe that resolving the problem of coming up with a new social interpretation of the Civil War, figuring out why this war took place and how it was rooted in social and economic changes, required a both theoretically rigorous and historically specific analysis of how capitalism develops in the United States. Now, in beginning this project, I was very lucky in the late 1970s and early 1980s, when I began this project, to be at the conjuncture of two important intellectual developments. On the one hand, the 70s and early 80s saw a revival of the debate about the origins of capitalism. In 1974, a historical sociologist named Emanuel Wallerstein publishes a book called The Modern World System, which revives a debate about how capitalism emerges in some part, all of Europe, some part of Europe, England alone, in the 1500s and 1600s. That debate, and in particular the contributions of the historian Robert Brenner and the political theorist Ellen Megskins Woods, that debate provided me with a set of fairly sophisticated theoretical tools to try to understand how capitalism, as a distinct form of social labor, a distinct way that human beings organize their relation to each other and to nature through the use of tools, emerges. I was also fortunate that this period saw a revival of historical research on both social and economic developments in the pre-Civil War antebellum US and on political developments. So with these two bodies of literature, I was able, over the course of some 20, 30 years, to try to develop an analysis of how capitalism develops that allows me to develop a distinctive approach to explaining the origins of the Civil War. Now, I'm hoping that my book will do three things. One is generally make a contribution to the defense of Marxism as an approach to the study of history, a defense of what can broadly be called a materialist conception of the historical process, where how people relate to each other and to nature in producing goods and services is what shapes how people understand the world, how they create mental roadmaps, ideology, and shapes how they organize their political relations, organize states, etc. In other words, it is an attempt to defend Marxism from what are become the dominant trends in social history in the past 20, 30 years, post-structuralism, postmodernism. Secondly, I hope to defend a particular type of Marxism that's been described as political Marxism. That Marxism rejects the idea that there is a trans-historical, that history is simply the trans-historical development of either the growth of the productivity of labor through tools and machines, the growth of what Marx called the productive forces, or that history can be understood simply as the growth of markets. Instead, this approach sees capitalism, basically focuses on the centrality of what Brenner's called social property relations, class relations, and the labor process. That each of these sets of class relations, each of these forms of social labor, have what they call strong rules of reproduction that produce periods of growth and periods of crisis. But that the transition from one social form to another is not predetermined, it's not teleological, but instead is the result of the contingent, unpredictable outcomes of class conflict, rooted in previous forms of social labor. And finally, as I said before, the last goal of this is to develop an analysis of the specific way capitalism develops in the United States that can provide a basis for a new social interpretation of the Civil War and Reconstruction. What I want to do is very broadly and very generally sum up my argument, and then we can go into questions, etc. later. My analysis starts with what I think is the paradox of British colonial expansion in the 16th and 17th centuries. Britain and Britain alone was while all the European powers attempted to conquer parts of the New World, expand the reach of trade networks, etc., to parts of Africa, Asia, etc. It was only British colonialism that was driven by the development of capitalism, particularly in British agriculture. Whereas other colonial powers were basically creating the sort of pre-capitalist empires that had existed for millennia, where they used state power to control trade routes, create mercantile monopolies, extract surplus product through the use of force from producers, etc. British colonialism had a very different character. It was being organized by merchants who were not reliant on royal monopolies and who were seeking to organize production of new goods in the colonies for a growing market made up of wealthy capitalist landowners and capitalist farmers. The paradox is that while British colonial expansion in the 17th and 16th, 17th, 18th century was the only one driven by the specific dynamics of capitalism, in North America, they were unable to establish capitalist social relations. And the reason they couldn't was they could not establish an effective market in land, they were very effective at, through the use of force and fraud, expropriate, in a genocidal expropriation of the indigenous populations, of the Native American populations. The problem was, once the white settlers showed up, they could not force these white settlers to pay for the land. Thus, white settlers were able to grab land on the frontier and become, in the north, self-sufficient farmers, and in many parts of the south, particularly in the hill countries, etc., self-sufficient farmers as well. So instead, what you see in the British North American colonies is the development of two distinctive non-capitalist forms. In the northern colonies, you get the development of what I call independent household production. The sort of the way peasants have organized production all around the world for millennia. They grab land through either squatting directly, just occupying it, clearing it, starting cultivation. They might eventually have to pay some small fee to the person who ostensibly legally owns the land. But essentially, they are able to obtain land outside of the market, and thus are able to devote most of their time and energy to producing for their own and their household subsistence, and market only their physical surpluses. They are under no compulsion to specialize output, introduce new machinery to cut costs, accumulate land and machines. In the South, we see the development of a highly commercial form of production, thoroughly integrated into the developing world market, but which is based on, what I'm going to argue in detail later, is a non-capitalist class relation, that between slaveholders and slaves. Now, this North American colony is increasingly bound together through the activity of merchants. And this is very typical in societies before capitalism. Merchants who buy and sell goods at distances and make their money by taking advantage of price differentials between isolated markets have often bought up the physical surpluses of peasants, sold them elsewhere, etc. Now, the American Revolution was the result of the struggle of these merchants with the support of subsistence farmers in the North, artisans in the North, and the slaveholding planters in the South to reproduce themselves as non-capitalist classes independent of Britain. Now, I argue in the book that the unintended consequence of the Revolution, in particular, the constitutional settlement of 1787, is the construction of a state that for the first time in the history of North America can actually construct a market in land. Now, the construction of a market in land and the imposition of what Marx called the land monopoly does not alter the relationship between masters and slaves in the South, but it does fundamentally alter northern agriculture. And what we see in the 1780s and 1790s is 20 years of massive rural struggles by these small farmers against land speculators who claim to have title to the land, against state governments, and against the federal government, starting with the Shays Rebellion in 1787 through the Whiskey Rebellion of 1794. There's literally dozens and dozens of struggles along the frontier, north and south, and throughout the northern colonies over the conditions under which these settlers are able to obtain, keep, and expand land holdings. Now, the consolidation of the constitutional settlement and the creation of a somewhat stronger central state with the power to tax and the power to organize a standing army and integrate what had previously been citizen militias into the federal structure and to professionalize them and put them under the control of a professional officer class essentially allows the federal government to suppress the rebellions by these farmers in the 1780s and 1790s. The result of these struggles is that from the 1790s onward, particularly in what becomes the northern U.S., the ability of farmers to get, keep, and expand land holdings requires them to buy the land at market prices. Public lands, the lands that are stolen from the Native Americans, are sold at public auction. Most of them are bought up by big landowning companies, which then resell them to actual settlers. The settlers are then find themselves fairly deep in debt in order to buy this land. So in order to then keep it, they had to specialize in cash crops, introduce new technology, accumulate, etc. Now, my argument is that it is this process that begins in the 1790s and culminates in the late 1830s, by which these northern household producers, these northern farmers, are subordinated to market coercion, where they have to sell to survive, or in Marxist terms, they are subordinated to the operation of the law of value, where they must produce at or below socially necessary labor time in order to make a profit, in order to maintain their land holdings, etc. That this process is the key moment in the emergence of capitalism in the North. That as these farmers are subordinated to the dictates of the market, we see the emergence of a massive home market for factory-produced goods. Previously, these households produced not only most of the foodstuffs they needed, but the women in the households in particular were involved in the home weaving of cloth, making shoes and boots, etc. As these households are forced to spend more and more labor time producing single goods for the market, the women in the household are no longer able to devote time to spinning and weaving cloth, making shoes, and they become a growing market for factory-produced means of consumption, consumer goods, textiles, shoes, and boots. Even more importantly, these farmers are then constantly searching for better tools and machinery that will allow them to reduce the amount of labor and increase the amount of output, amount of crops, animals, etc. So they become a growing market for factory-produced farm machinery, farm implements. This growing petty capitalist agricultural sector provides the basis for the uniquely U.S. path of capitalist industrialization, the emergence of what I call an agro-industrial complex, a series of industries either processing agricultural products or providing inputs, meat packing, mechanized flour milling, farm implements production, etc. Now this process, I argue, is completed by the late 1830s and early 1840s. At this point, the activity of merchants involved in land speculation, international trade, particularly in slave-produced cotton, etc., no longer bind together the U.S. economy. Instead, increasingly, it's the interactions of these petty capitalist farmers, these petty bourgeois farmers, and capitalist manufacturing that is the dynamic force in the U.S. economy. It is at this point, I would argue, from about 1840 on, that the expansion of slavery goes from being one of the spurs of the development of markets and commodity production, etc., in the United States, to an obstacle to the development of capitalism. And in order to get to this, we have to understand the character of plantation slavery in the U.S., and I'd argue in the New World generally. Now, clearly, all the New World slave societies were thoroughly commercial, profit-driven enterprises. The idea that slaveholding planters saw themselves as feudal lords who, wanted to have, lots of dependents, etc., and were concerned mostly with their own consumption, is simply nonsense. These people went deeply into debt to buy land and slaves. They had to, in order to maintain their ownership of land and slaves, compete in the world market. They, like any other commercial producer, had to sell to survive. It's their integration into the world market that gives slavery in the New World, and particularly in the U.S. South, some of its features that are similar to that of capitalist production. Centralized gang labor, detailed division of tasks, authoritarian management. Some historians have gone as far to argue that scientific management, breaking down tasks into simple forms so that workers can do their jobs in an almost thoughtless fashion, didn't start with Frederick Winslow Taylor in the early 20th century, but was really invented on the slave plantations, particularly of the U.S. South. However, I would argue that because of the distinctive non-capitalist relationship between masters and slaves, slave owners respond to market coercion in a way that is fundamentally different from capitalist producers. Now, for me, what makes slavery non-capitalist is not that slaves were unfree, thus supposedly lacking motivation to work hard, develop skills, master new tools. I think this is true of wage laborers as well, and I make this argument somewhat in the book. What makes slavery non-capitalist, in my opinion, is that slaves appear not as what Marx called variable capital. Slave owners don't buy slaves' ability to work, their labor power, for a fixed period of time. They buy the slave, as Du Bois put it, as means of production in human form. They buy the slave, body and soul, as a machine, essentially. In other words, slaves enter the production process as a form of fixed capital, which must be kept working at all times, and who cannot be easily expelled from production in order to replace labor with machines. Think about, this is the example I would give very simply. In a capitalist plantation, the capitalists, if they discover a better way, a new machine that will allow them to plant double the acreage with half the workers and harvest it with half the workers, simply at the end of the year, lay off half the workers whose labor power they bought for a year, and then those workers are free to go someplace else, find another job, starve to death. They're not a concern for capitalists. Under slavery, the slaveholders have bought the slave as a piece of machinery from their point of view. Thus, if there's an available technology that will allow them to replace slaves with machines, they can't just lay off the slaves. They have to sell the slaves in order to protect their investment. Just to give you a sense of this, a so-called prime male field hand, a young man between the ages of 16 and 30, the price of a prime field hand in 1860 in the South was $1,500, which in today's dollars is about $350,000. In other words, from the point of view of the planter, the slave was a major and expensive piece of machinery who could not be simply let go in order to introduce labor-saving technology. As a result, slaveholders, while they accumulate more land and slaves in response to market pressures, cannot technologically innovate. They cannot replace living labor with dead labor, humans with tools and machines. And there is limits on specialization. I'll make the argument detail later about how, in fact, slaves have to be kept working all year round, which is a difficult thing to do in agriculture because of the slack season. So in most slaveholding societies, slave masters put their slaves to work producing their own subsistence rather than buying. The result is you have in the South and in all the plantation societies in the New World a very shallow social division of labor, a very shallow home market. There's not much demand for tools and machinery, and there's not much demand even for foodstuffs, clothing, etc., because the plantations seek to be self-sufficient in all of these things. Basically, the most rational way for slaveholders to respond to market competition, to expand output as prices rise, is to add more slaves and more land. In other words, geographic expansion is built into the slave system. Now, before 1840, when the activity of merchants bound together the U.S. economy, exports of slave-produced cotton allow for the U.S. and U.S. merchants to have a favorable balance of trade with Europe. This allows them to import money capital, borrow money, float bonds, etc., on European markets, which then flow into land speculation. One of the things I discovered in the course of my research is that there is very little, almost no evidence of profits from slavery flowing directly into manufacturing. Instead, they flow to banks, merchant houses, and then into land speculation, fueling waves of land speculation, fueling the expansion of both family farming in the north and plantation slavery in the south. Now, after 1840, what I argue, and so thus one could say that before 1840, the continued geographic expansion of slavery promotes the development of commodity circulation, commodity production in the United States. After 1840, once it's no longer merchants who are the dynamic force in the U.S. economy, but instead these petty capitalist farmers and capitalist manufacturers, then I argue that the geographic expansion of slavery becomes incompatible with the development of capitalism. From 1840 on, the key to the development of industrial capitalism in the United States is the continuous expansion of an agro-industrial frontier, the continuous expansion of small capitalist farming across the U.S. with a growing capitalism, with a growing market for both consumer goods and capital goods. The expansion of slavery and the expansion of this form of commercial family farming are incompatible. In regions where slavery was dominant, non-slaveholding white farmers essentially became peasant producers, subsistence producers. They were pushed off of the best land into the hill countries, into the pine barrens, etc. In other words, in areas where if slavery continued to expand, that would mean that petty bourgeois, petty capitalist agriculture could not expand. It is this, I would argue, this growing contradiction between the conditions for the growth of capitalist manufacturing in the north, in the U.S., versus the conditions for the continued survival and expansion of plantation slavery in the 1840s and 1850s that sets the stage for the explosive political conflicts that culminate in the Civil War. It's this growing economic contradiction that leads to realignments in both the North and the South, the destruction of nationally organized parties, the Democrats and Whigs, and the emergence of the polarization of politics in the U.S. by the 1850s between two basically sectional parties. The Republicans, who organized an alliance between capitalist manufacturers, farmers, and some skilled workers on the one hand, and the Southern Democrats, who organized the bulk of the planter class. The Republicans are arguing for free soil, the containment of slavery within the South, which even the most conservative Republicans argued would put slavery on the road to, quote, eventual extinction, as Lincoln puts it in one of the debates with Frederick Douglass. On the other hand, the Southern Democrats increasingly demand no federal restrictions on the expansion of slavery, particularly to the territories conquered from Mexico, and by the late 1850s, 1860, are in fact demanding that the federal government positively protect slavery by creating a federal slave code, protecting the property rights of the slaveholders in human beings in the unorganized territories. I argue in the book then that this growing polarization culminates in 1860 with the election of Lincoln, at which point is a clear signal to the planters in the South that their future, the future of their form of social labor, of plantation slavery, and its ability to continue to geographically expand within the context of a unified U.S. capitalist state is over. They then opt for secession, and the northern ruling classes, both the industrialists and the merchants, cannot tolerate this schism, the division of the country, which then leads to the Civil War. Now, in the course of the war, I argue, following many other historians, that the goal of the mainstream of the Republican Party was simply to restore the status quo before the war, to restore the Union with slavery excluded from the territories, but legally protected in the South. But the problem was, the only way they could win the war is by disrupting slavery in the South. If you look at the way the war goes in the first 6 months to a year, while the South is much less industrialized, their armies are not as technologically sophisticated as those of the North, they have the advantage of fighting a defensive war. And as at least some of us can remember in our own lifetimes, and others will know from reading history, there are examples in the last 30, 40 years of relatively technologically backward armies defeating fairly technologically advanced armies, like in Vietnam, where the most powerful military force in world history was defeated by armed peasants. Okay? If you're fighting a defensive war, you have that advantage. And as long as the planters, the Confederacy, believed that their rear was peaceful, that there would not be a disruption of the master-slave relationship, they were able to resist the attempts by the Federal Army to reunify the country. It was only as the Northern Army makes incursions into the South, sparking what Du Bois calls the general strike, the mass flight of slaves from the plantations, that Lincoln and the Republicans are forced, out of military necessity, to acknowledge that the war would in fact lead to the end of slavery. Now, I conclude the book by trying to figure out the sort of social and economic and political meaning of the war in Reconstruction. And what I argue is that as what Marxists call a bourgeois revolution, a revolution that consolidates the political rule of the capitalist class and which removes obstacles to the development of capitalism as a form of social labor, the Civil War was a completed revolution. It destroyed slavery, and while the form of production that replaces slavery in the South, sharecropping, is not capitalist, and I argue Southern agriculture doesn't become fully capitalist until the early 20th century, after the defeat of populism and the imposition of Jim Crow. But the imposition of Jim Crow was in fact the necessary condition for the development of capitalist agriculture in the South. Sharecropping didn't have the same geographic expansionist dynamic as slavery. It expanded cotton cultivation not into the Southwest and Midwest, but into the hill countries. The Civil War also sees the consolidation of protective tariffs, etc. So as a bourgeois revolution, it was quite complete and quite successful. However, it was also, at the same time, a radical, plebeian, popular democratic revolution. Despite the intentions of the Republicans, the war unleashed tremendous popular struggles in both the North and the South. Most of us are probably most familiar with the struggles in the South. Hundreds of thousands of African American slaves free themselves, the first form of self-emancipation. In fact, some Marxists argue that Marx got the whole phrase and notion of self-emancipation from the general strike of the slaves during the Civil War. Millions of slaves free themselves and go about demanding land, which they don't get, the right to citizenship, the right to vote, and are able to use for a period of a decade after the Civil War their newfound political power to protect themselves against taxation, rent racking, etc. This radical democratic movement, of course, as we know in the South, is smashed in the 1870s as the Northern Republicans, in the face of the radical movement in the North, which I'll talk about in a second, retreat from their commitment to keeping troops in the South, keeping the Klan and the old planter class at bay. In the North, we also see a tremendous explosion of popular radicalism. Marx argued that the reason that working class organizations and socialists and radicals had to support the North in the Civil War was not because they were socialists, but because the abolition of slavery would open the road to the emergence of an independent workers' movement in the North. By 1867-68, we see the formation of the first national labor union, the National Labor Union, which includes black wage workers in the South and the North, the first biracial, what's called back then, a biracial workers' movement. This movement is not only fighting around wages and hours, but is involved in tremendous political agitation in the late 1860s for the 10-hour day, for the legal limitation of the working day. The increasing radicalism of the workers in the North is what, in fact, some historians argue, de-radicalized the radical Republicans. Because while they were perfectly happy with the idea of making former slaves into good bourgeois citizens, the idea that bourgeois citizens would use these rights to press for working class demands scared the living crap out of them. And we see then, although the 10 Hours movement is defeated, we see by the 1870s a new revival of struggle in the context of a growing recession, growing depression in the United States, particularly massive strikes on the railroads. And 1877 sees the withdrawal of federal troops from the South to be used against striking railroad workers across the North. So my conclusion is that the Civil War and Reconstruction were a very successful bourgeois revolution, but a failed democratic revolution. And which leads me to question the notion that many 20th century Marxists have had of a bourgeois democratic revolution, of a revolution that would produce both the conditions for capitalism and radical democratic reforms, land reform, universal suffrage, legal limitation of the working day, etc. In fact, as Ellen Maidstone Woods argues in her book Democracy versus Capitalism, capitalism is inimical to any real substantive democracy. For capitalism, democracy must be limited to, as Marx put it, the oppressed every few years choosing electing which of their oppressors will rule them, and democracy must be limited to liberalism, the defense of individual rights. Okay. I've been babbling for too long, I'm going to stop. Thank you. I have one favor to ask people when they ask questions, although I know some of you, if people could identify themselves so that when I then respond to you, I won't be going, and I'd like to respond to the person over there, I can respond by name. Yes?
Mark.
Mark.
You sprinkled some of his quotes all throughout your talk, but in the beginning when you were breaking down the historiography and sociology related to the Civil War, you mentioned the Beards, but then you skipped right over Du Bois's Black Reconstruction in America, which he dropped in 1935, which is a straight historical materialist argument of the Civil War, and he makes a similar argument about the failure of Reconstruction is kind of a failure of a democratic revolution due to a lack of solidarity between the working classes. What would be the differences and similarities between, if you're familiar with that?
Street.
Yeah. What would be the similarities and differences between like your argument and Du Bois's in that book?
Let me take a couple other questions.
I'm trying to get
Your name again?
Aaron Schachter. I'm trying to get a better understanding of the distinction you made between, why you would say slavery is not capitalism, and I want to restate what I thought it was and see if I've got this right. If your equipment consists of slaves, then you can't replace them with better equipment. You can only replace them with more of the same kind of equipment. Whereas with any other kind of capitalism, you can replace your equipment with better equipment. Is that?
Okay, well, let me start with Mark's question. Du Bois's Black Reconstruction, when it came out, was completely dismissed by every professional historian. Because at that point, the dominant historiography on Reconstruction in particular was influenced by basically these Southern racists who saw Reconstruction as this terrible mistake of giving backward African Americans the right to vote. It produced all this corruption, etc. And of course, their argument was, we corrected that with Jim Crow. So they all dismissed it. Today, in fact, especially since the 60s and 70s, Du Bois's work is seen as the groundstone, the fundamental work on Reconstruction. Eric Foner's book that he put out in the 80s, Reconstruction and Unfinished Revolution, basically is a updating, deepening of Du Bois's argument. Now, Du Bois, though, doesn't actually make an argument about the causation of the Civil War, which is my main concern. His concern is primarily the dynamics of the struggle in the South, in particular the struggle of the freed people for democracy. And I think that his analysis is in many ways spot on. I think he actually overestimates initially the divisions between poor whites and poor blacks in the early years of Reconstruction. In fact, most of the non-slaveholding whites by 1866, 67, 68 are voting Republican. Okay? They're voting Republican. They're in the same political party and aligned with the former freed people, who are the mass base for the Republican Party in the South. I think his analysis of the general strike, his analysis, although I don't like his phrase, the dictatorship of labor, as a description of what exists in the South, captures something that's very, very important, which is while, in fact, white Republicans in the North dominated the newly founded Republican parties in the South in the 1860s and 70s. Most of the governors, Republican senators and Congress people, most of the Republican state legislators are white. There's a significant minority who are African American. However, what radical Reconstruction does is puts African Americans, former slaves, in control of key local offices in the South, justices of the peace and county assessors, who have a very, very important role in shaping the relationship between sharecropping tenants and their landlords. And essentially, these people are the ones who make sure that the landlords do not pass on increasing taxes on land to their tenants, who ensure that the sharecroppers get the first claim on the crop, and that any debts they owe to the planters, who also act as money lenders and merchants, are secondary, etc. And that Du Bois was absolutely lucid that it was, in fact, the key goal of redemption, the restoration of white supremacy in the 1870s, was breaking the power of these black elected officials at a local level so that the planters could, in fact, the landlords, in fact, could raise rents, collect debts, etc., which then put them in a position not only to really impoverish their black tenants in what used to be the plantation districts, the black belts, but also then spread tenancy into the pine barrens and the upcountry, transforming non-slaveholding white farmers from basically independent farmers who owned their own land, who engaged in subsistence, transforming them for the most part into tenant farmers, which then provides the basis, which then by the 1880s means that for the first time, essentially since Bacon's Rebellion in 1676, poor whites and poor blacks in the South are not only both poor, but they actually occupy the same class position. They're all tenant farmers. And this is what provides the basis for the multiracial populist movement in the South. And it's only through Jim Crow, through appeals to racism, that movement is defeated, and I argue then opening to capitalist agriculture in the South in the early 20th century. But I think that Du Bois's analysis of Reconstruction is crucial.
No,
He just doesn't really address the question that I'm most concerned with, and I spend most of my analysis on, which is why the Civil War. In terms of Eric's question, it's basically that they can't replace workers with machines or tools. It's very, very difficult once slaveholders have established slavery in a particular region, in a particular crop, to introduce labor-saving technology. Because in order to get rid of surplus slaves, you have to find somebody who's going to buy them. Now, the expansion of slavery in the US into what's the Southwest, Alabama, Mississippi, etc., in the 1820s, 30s, etc., allow slaveholders in Maryland and parts of Virginia to sell off excess slaves, break down their plantations, and basically become patty capitalist farmers. But it was the continuous expansion of slavery that allowed that. In the plantation districts, that couldn't happen because there was no one else to sell slaves to. Plus, cotton prices were high enough before the Civil War, especially because the US was provided 90 to 95% of the world's cotton before the Civil War, that the planters figured we can respond quite easily by grabbing more land, more slaves. Okay? So in other words, it's the fact that under slavery, the slaveholder does not purchase the slave's labor power, their ability to work, which then they can, if they no longer need them after a day, a week, a year, they can get rid of them easily. They can expel them for production. Under slavery, they buy the slave as means of production in human form, which means that they've invested, in today's dollars, almost over $250,000. They're not just going to let them go. Thus, there's little incentive for them to introduce labor-saving technology, and instead, the way they meet market demand is by adding more slaves, more land. Geographic expansion.
So you answered in that my first question, which is why was Jim Crow the condition for the development of capitalist relations in the South? But maybe if you could reiterate that again. And then another question, and it is related to the talk, but maybe sort of to your introduction of why this analysis is important. You're talking about how it's important to see capitalism as something that has a history, rather than just this inevitable outgrowth of the social division of labor or technology or markets, and et cetera. So, and you also referred to the recent appearance of Occupy Wall Street and the Indignados in Europe and things like that. And most of those groups, they sort of frame their approaches in opposition to crony capitalism, finance capitalism, gangster capitalism. Even a lot of them will say, especially here in the US, we need to bring manufacturing jobs back here, the good old manufacturing capitalism, back when it was so great here. So how can we take those movements from that consciousness to an opposition to capitalism? Just in general, capitalism.
Your name is?
I'm Rachel.
Rachel.
I was just wondering if you thought there were any other factors that played into the Civil War starting besides that slavery was in opposition to capitalism, or a barrier to capitalism.
All right, well, let me start with your question. See, what I would argue is this, that in terms of the way people understood the conflicts that lead to the Civil War, I think that they understood it in terms, not in terms of the terms I'm laying out. They didn't understand it as, well, the capitalist mode of production requires a deepening social division of labor, requires agriculture that, specializes, innovates, etc. Instead, in the North, the Republicans are able to garner support around a worldview that says free labor, where workers can earn the benefits of the fruits of their labor, is in fact a better system. It is a better system economically because free workers have incentive to work harder, develop their skills, etc. And it is the only system, they argue, that can provide both economic growth and provide the basis for Republican government, because it allows for people to become self-employed or skilled workers, and thus will short-circuit the formation of a propertyless and politically dangerous working class. Now, from the point of view of the 21st century, these arguments seem a little bit bizarre, because in fact, the implementation of the Republican program, in fact, deepens capitalism, produces a large working class, etc., etc. But I would argue is that the analysis I'm putting forward of how capitalism developed and the specific contradictions between the expansion of capitalism and the expansion of slavery necessarily produced these sorts of ideas, made them the common sense for literally millions of people in the North, for skilled workers, for commercial farmers, for small capitalist manufacturers. Because one of the things I didn't get into is that the way the capitalist class, the manufacturing capitalist class in the US develops is not rich merchants who've made shitloads of money selling slaves and cotton and invest in factories. Instead, it's through the process of the enrichment of artisans. Well-off master artisans become capitalists. If you look at the iron industry, if you look at meat packing, if you look at flour milling, if you look at farm implements machine production, etc., they all start off with relatively small artisan shops where the owner is working side by side with their workers, thus seeing themselves as labor as well. And it's only as markets grow because of the transformation of northern agriculture and their markets grow that you start to see growing social differentiation. Some of these artisans start to do real well, accumulate more tools, hire more workers, many more lose their property and become wage workers. So that the idea that free labor provides opportunities for everyone, allows people to accrue the fruits of their labor, etc., makes common sense to folks like that. And thus, for them, slavery is an unnatural system because it deprives human beings of their most basic right. Now, that most basic right, Lincoln was very clear in the Lincoln-Douglas debates, did not necessarily include citizenship or the right to vote, but it included most fundamentally the right to the fruits of your own labor, the right to sell yourself freely or become self-employed. On the other hand, the planter class, because of their particular relationship with slaves in the world market, develop a very particular worldview. For them, the problem with containing slavery within the South is not that, oh well, we can't then, well, how are we going to respond to increasing market pressures, and because we can't introduce machines, etc. Instead, they see this as, perceive the crisis that will happen as, you keep us penned up, then what's going to happen is what happened in the Caribbean. The black slave population will soon outstrip the free white population. Because you got to remember, the southern U.S. is the only slave society in the New World where white people are a majority. And where most white people were not slaveholders. In the Caribbean, Jamaica, Haiti, the slave districts in Cuba, etc., African American slaves vastly outnumbered the white slave owners, and there were very few non-slaveholding whites. So they perceive it in that way. They also perceive slavery as a superior system. From the 1820s on, they're arguing that slavery is a superior system because, on the one hand, it will provide for, they believe that, following Adam Smith, that economic growth requires a propertyless laboring class. But here we have a propertylessly laboring class that has no rights, that are not citizens, that don't vote, and thus won't be like the socialistic proletariat in Europe. You read the stuff they put out in the late 1840s in response to the 1848 revolutions in Europe. They're basically saying slavery is the solution to the labor problem. White people will all be citizens, all be property owners. Some of us will own slaves as well as land. Most of you just own land. And economic growth will be based on these people doing the work and building the economy, but they'll have no rights. So that because of the way these relationships develop very concretely, they develop certain ways of understanding it. But in order to understand that those mental roadmaps, for me, ideology is not false consciousness. It's a mental roadmap of people's lived experience. And in order to understand why it takes the form it does, you have to have a really in-depth understanding of that lived experience. And the more you get into the concreteness, the the depth of that those relationships and that lived experience, then you understand why they saw the world in the way that they did. So that if you ask them, is this war just about slavery versus capitalism, they'd scratch their heads and look at you like you're insane. In fact, most of the people in the North, who we would identify as capitalist manufacturers, didn't think of themselves as capitalists. In fact, before the Civil War, there's a very famous quote from Lincoln about labor is prior to capital. Without labor, there is no capital. And many on the left have taken this to mean that Lincoln was maybe some sort of closet socialist. No, that's a complete misunderstanding, because in the antebellum North, labor meant anybody involved in production. Skilled wage workers, self-employed artisans, capitalist manufacturers. Capital were the parasites, and this is what gets into, I'm going to get to Jace's question next. Parasites, merchants, bankers, money lenders, etc., and the slaveholders, who lived off the labor of their slaves. Now this gets to Jace's question about, I think that because of the way capitalism develops, and in particular in periods when workers' movements are very weak, when workers, as workers organized in unions and political parties of their own, etc., don't have much of a presence in social struggles, these sorts of ideas of crony capitalism, finance, etc., gain a lot of leverage. I think that it's not going to be so much the arguments we make, but the sort of struggles that socialists help build that will be the counter to that. The fact you can say, hey, wait a minute, look at what, it's not just crony capitalism, look at Chicago. It's capitalism, it's workers and bosses. I also happen to think, and this is my next research project, the notion that manufacturing has disappeared from the industrialized countries, including this country, is simply wrong. You live in a state which is probably close to outstripping Michigan as a center of the auto industry. There's a very good dissertation that was done on the auto industry that showed that in the 70s and 80s, when they were shutting down plants in Michigan and Ohio and Indiana, they were not shipping them to Mexico or Brazil. They were setting them up in the South. Kentucky, well, more of the American companies were going to Alabama, Mississippi, and Texas. After about 1995, after the Auto Workers Union basically completely capitulates and agrees to almost everything that the Big Three wants, then they start retooling the plants in the North. So one of the things I'm trying to do in my next research project is show how this happens in other industries. That the problem is not that industry has disappeared, but that the labor movement in the United States has been in a profound and long-term political and ideological crisis. And that it's not a question of finding new revolutionary subjects, but of rebuilding the capacity of workers, particularly industrial workers, which, by the way, are the most multiracial sections of the working class in this country. In terms of the Jim Crow stuff, let me make the argument briefly is this. Sharecropping originates as a concession by the planters to the demands of former slaves for land. In the immediate post-Civil War period, the planters go on the offensive, take over the reconstructed state governments, and pass what are known as the Black Codes. The Black Codes are a series of laws basically designed to legally coerce the former slaves into selling their labor power to the planters under really bad conditions. Basically, they said everybody has to fight. Anybody who signs a contract for a year's work who leaves it early is a criminal. Any person of color found on the roads without a job is a criminal. Anybody who attempts to leave their employment early is subject to fines, jailing, etc. Between the struggle of the freed people themselves, who led primarily by Union Army veterans, who come back with guns and organizational experience, etc., and who form what are called the Union Leagues, which were basically black paramilitary organizations that on the one hand campaigned for suffrage in the Republican Party, and then on the other hand went out and basically said any attempts at white racist terror would be met with arms. Between that and the radicalization of the Republican and radicalization of Northern public opinion, which is outraged by the black codes as a violation of free labor norms, we see in 1867-68 the very rapid passage of the Civil Rights Act, 14th Amendment, 15th Amendment. By 1868, you have a whole new re-election of state governments in the South, which are now dominated by the Republicans. They repeal the black codes, and in the midst of this, basically the planters know that they cannot maintain centralized plantations using gang labor. For various reasons, we can talk about some other time, if people are interested, I can go into it. The Northern industrialists will not do a radical land reform, because they know quite rightly that if they just give land to the former slaves are going to become subsistence peasants. They're not going to become good commercial farmers. Hell, the white folks in the North didn't become good commercial farmers until you sold them land and put them in debt and forced them to become commercial farmers. So what emerges is the planters basically say, okay, we can't maintain centralized gang labor, we will lease plots of land, 40 to 60 acres, 60 to 80 acres, to individual black households under sharecropping arrangements. Now, as I said before, during the period of radical Reconstruction, when African Americans dominated these county offices, justices of the peace, county assessors, etc., the sharecroppers were in a pretty strong position to resist raising rents, imposition of taxes, usury, etc. After that, after the end of Reconstruction, the planters really go on the offensive, both against black sharecroppers and against the former white yeomanry. This lays the basis for the populist movement, which is very successful in the 1880s and 1890s. They elect several state governments, they pass laws that restrict the ability of planters and merchants to have what are called crop liens, the first claim on the crop, etc. In response to this, the planters unleash this racist terror, divide the movement along racial lines, and then impose Jim Crow, which is not, and I think which is both legal segregation, disenfranchisement of most African Americans in the 1890s, and a significant portion of poor whites, and the renewal of racial terror, lynching, etc. And this provides the environment in which the planters can finally do in the early 1900s what they wanted to do in 1865 and 66. Reestablish the plantations as centralized units of production where sharecroppers become transformed into wage laborers. What happens is, in the late 1890s, early 1900s, the planters basically renegotiate leases with their tenants and their sharecroppers, and they say, okay, instead of giving you 80 acres, we're going to give you an acre or two where you can have a garden and you can grow food, and we'll make sure that you're here not only for planting but for harvesting. And we'll pay you, your wage will be a share of the crop, but you will work under the supervision of overseers, etc., working in centralized gangs, and they start to reconsolidate the cotton plantations, etc. And this then provides the basis for the beginning of the introduction, even before the First World War, of new tools and machinery. By the time of the First World War, the planters had basically mechanized planting. They had introduced gas-driven tractors, and they had begun to reduce the amount of labor they needed for planting. They had the big bottleneck is in the harvest. And they don't solve that until during the Second World War with mechanized harvest. But it's the fact that you're beginning to get capitalist agriculture, the beginning of the mechanization of harvesting, suddenly you don't need as much black labor on the plantations as you did before. And this provides the basis for the beginnings of the first wave of the Great Migration. First of African Americans from the countryside to southern cities, then increasingly during the First World War to the northern cities. That, of course, as this process of mechanization is completed with the mechanization of the harvest during the Second World War, this provides the basis for basically the transformation of African Americans into a predominantly urban and predominantly northern people. But it's the destruction of the political power of African Americans and poor whites, and the imposition of racial terror that allows the planters to do what they couldn't do in 1866, 67, they can do that in 1900. So the idea that many sort of mainstream liberal sociologists, and even some Marxists have, that racism, political coercion of this sort, etc., is contradictory to capitalism, I would argue exactly the opposite. For capitalism to actually develop in the South required this sort of repressive, racist, and anti-democratic regime. I think I answered all the questions so far.
I was thinking of a question earlier
Your name?
regarding, Kirk Wells. I was thinking of a question regarding, a little bit earlier than this, is regarding, I guess this centralization of force, like the forming of the U.S. military as a united military entity as opposed to separate, disparate militias. I was curious as to what were the factors that went into the creation of that. Was it the, like you were saying, capitalist interests, or was it just the threat of impending violence from, say, the British?
Well, no, actually, see, what I would argue is that the revolution is basically fought by the militias.
Right.
The regular army does grow, but it is almost completely dismantled in 1781. There is tremendous, you got to remember, the coalition that makes the American Revolution is this very uneasy alliance of, on the one hand, merchants who are interested in buying and selling shit, they're not interested in producing things. But they want something of a strong centralized government so that they can secure the public debt, collect enough taxes to pay their creditors in Europe, so they can maintain good credit relations for international trade, etc. So they, from the beginning, want a stronger central government. Against them are these subsistence farmers in the north, in particular, and artisans in the city, who see a strong central government, and particularly a standing army, as a form of tyranny. Particularly because that would allow for the imposition of more and more taxes on them. And it would cut off, the farmers in particular realized they would cut off their ability to grab land outside of the market. Okay? The planter class is very ambivalent in the early 1780s about this whole question. Because on the one hand, they'd like a stronger central state government for a variety of reasons. They are involved in international trade. They want to have a secure the public debt and have good international credit. And they'd like although they do quite well just with the slave patrols and their own state militias, because there's enough free whites, free non-slave holding whites, to be integrated into these slave patrols, etc., to discipline the slaves. But what they fear is a strong central government which might eventually be taken over by people who don't like slavery and might undermine their ability to exploit their slaves. Now, what shifts and there's continuous struggles over this from like 1781 with the end of the war to 1787. At one point, Alexander Hamilton and several other officers attempt a military coup, which is smashed in 1782 or 83. In order to create a strong central government. What's key is Shays' Rebellion. Shays' Rebellion. Bacon's Rebellion was the 1670s. Shays' Rebellion in 1786, 1787 in Massachusetts, where the Massachusetts government is imposing taxes and setting up courts in Western Mass, basically saying, if you can't pay your debts and taxes, we're actually going to evict you from your land. There's this huge rebellion of these subsistence farmers. It takes 6 months for the Massachusetts militia to put down Shays' Rebellion. 6 months to put down a rebellion that at most involved 5,000 to 7,000 armed men. This sends a shockwave to the planters, who see, oh my God, if we're going to continue to rely at a national level on citizen militias made up of these subsistence farmers, artisans, etc., who go as far as electing their own officers, etc., then if there are slave revolts, and these people are looking, you know, this is only a few years before the Haitian Revolution. They're already seeing the French Revolution. They're already worried about slave revolts. They then there's a shift in the position of the planters to say, yes, we need to centralize the state. And part of the constitutional settlement is not only the creation of a central federal government that has the power to tax and the power to establish a central standing army, which increases from about 500 to 2,000 men in about 2 years. But more importantly, the Constitution allows for the federalization of the state militias. The state militias come under federal control. The governors still call them out, but the president can call them out too. In 1794, during the Whiskey Rebellion, Washington calls out state militias from Pennsylvania and several other states to smash the Whiskey Rebellion. It also requires them to professionalize, have professional officers, not elected officers. It also requires them to have more modern weapons, more modern discipline, etc. So it's that shift that then puts the merchants and the land speculators in a much stronger position than to smash all of these rebellions in the 1790s through the 1790s, which then shifts the relationship of forces in the north, so that in the future, settlers who want to become family farmers have to buy land. They can no longer basically squat on land or pay minimal prices. Does that get at your question?
Yeah.
So that army is really the centralized standing army in the U.S. and the professionalization of the militia is in response to threats from below within this society.
So not threats from beyond, but...
No, they had, basically they had figured they thought they had gotten rid of the Brits. They come back. They come back because they don't completely withdraw from some of, but the thing is, it doesn't really become an issue until white settlement starts to move into the Trans-Allegheny West, which really starts to take place only after 1800. And then after the Louisiana Purchase, it really becomes a big issue that they've got to be removed. The British garrisons in what's now the Ohio Valley need to be removed. Let's just see if there's other folks.
Andy. So I have a question. You mentioned the decline of the labor movement kind of like on the whole in the United States. But my question concerns, living in Tennessee, I've never known it even to exist regionally whatsoever. Even on the very basic level, I'll go to work and, workers will talk about, being overworked and underpaid on one hand, and then on the other hand, blame unions. It's completely non-existent. Now, would you attribute this directly to the way that capitalism formed here in the South, or were there events between what we've covered here today and then the present that greatly influenced it that I would not be aware of?
Hi, this is Craig. My question, I guess, a lot of people in popular movements today talk about, like Jay said, crony capitalism. Now it's a problem that is fairly recent, in the past 30 or 40 years. How far back would you date capitalist influence on American politics?
Eric.
You said that ideology is an expression of lived experience or something like that. And that got me wondering, maybe this is a silly question, but if you were doing a remake of the film Gone with the Wind, what would you change to make it more historically realistic or more insightful or something?
I was actually thinking about that too. I was just thinking that.
Well, starting with that, because that's the easiest. If it was realistic, Mammy would have slit Tara's Scarlett's throat and taken her off sometime in the middle of the war. That's would have made it real. What's interesting about Gone with the Wind, see, what Gone with the Wind is actually not so much the self-image of the South in 1865 or even 1877. It's a product of it's the product of the success of Jim Crow. It's a product of what C. Van Woodward calls the New South. And it's now they're looking back and saying, they're attempting to, people like Margaret Mitchell and others are trying to say, oh yeah, we should have done this in 1865. We should have made sure that the former slaves never became citizens, never voted, continued to know their place. It's only because of the agitation of these horrendous, manipulative white people from the North. Because of course, people of color have no volition, no self-activity, no history. This is in the minds of people like Mitchell and the New South ideologues. So that they then create this whole mythology of the cavalier planters who are concerned with military honor and who basically reinvented feudal lords, etc. Nobody was saying that. I mean, you read the stuff that they're putting out there's a very good new book that shows that for the most part in the 1840s and 50s, the ideologists of the planter class were basically saying, we are the source of all wealth and growth in this country. Without us, the northern economy will collapse. Which is one of the reasons they were absolutely confident that they could secede from the US, and that they were confident that the North would compromise with them, or they would allow them to secede and not go after them, because they believed that the North was economically dependent on the South. In terms of capitalist influence, in some ways it's from the beginning, from the establishment of an independent state that consolidates the interests that is dominated by and creates the conditions for the growth of mercantile activity, buying and selling of land, goods, etc. I would argue that the Civil War basically consolidates the rule of productive capitalists. Now, I don't see the capitalists dominating the state. I don't see the state as an institution separate and apart from the capitalist system. I think the state is one of the forms that structurally that exists under capitalism, and that the particular form the state takes, where the state takes the form of impersonal power, standing above class relations, standing above individuals, etc., is a product of capitalism itself. And there's several good things you could take a look at, etc. I think this whole notion of crony capitalism refers to, it is either it's part of an old populist discourse, which basically says the free market and market competition is good. The market is a sphere of equality and freedom. The reason that we get inequality is because there are people who manipulate the market, who get the government involved, etc. This is the sort of, it takes right and left-wing forms. The right-wing form, is Ron Paul. The problem is the Fed. Okay? There's left-wing forms of this as well. The problem is the Fed, or the problem is, the influence of money in politics, etc. And while, as Democrats and socialists, we should advocate, public funding of campaigns, etc., that's not going to change the fundamentally capitalist character, the structure of the state. And that the problem for me is not crony capitalism. It's not a distortion of commodity exchange and commodity production, but it's generalization under capitalism. And one could make, but in terms of the U.S. from independence on is a capitalist state. It consolidates conditions for the development of capitalism, and particularly after the Civil War, it does that even more. Andy's question. I would argue that I think that there's two factors that shape why there is no Southern labor movement, okay, historically. The first is, I think, the conditions under which capitalism emerged, capitalist agriculture, then capitalist manufacturing emerged in the South in a regime of Jim Crow, which set up informal forms of racial segregation at the workplace. Through the 1920s and 30s, blacks could not get jobs in the cotton mills. When other industries moved down, African Americans are put into certain, segregated in certain positions, etc. And you have a general political climate of extra-legal terror, which is easily used not just against African Americans, but against the labor movement as well. I don't know how many of you have read Michael Honey's first book. He's the guy who wrote the book, it's the book about Dr. King and the Memphis sanitation strike. But his first book, it looks at race and class in Memphis from the 20s to the 40s. And anybody speaking for the Congress of Industrial Organizations in Memphis risked being lynched. So that's part of it. But I think the key is, in terms of why there's no labor movement in the South, is that the same process that leads to the consolidation of bureaucratic business unionism in the North and the basically bureaucratization of the CIO in the 40s short circuits the attempt to organize the South. In 46, 47, the CIO was going to launch what they called Operation Dixie. They were going to go to the South and begin to organize. Now, there was a Southern labor movement. The Communist Party, the Socialist Party, and others had built small bastions of industrial unionism, particularly, the United Mine Workers had always had some presence in the South, particularly in Appalachia and further south in Alabama, among coal miners, but the mine mill and smelter workers, which eventually become part of the steel workers, had significant outposts in Birmingham and other centers as well. There was the tobacco and farm workers unions were very strong in certain areas in the tobacco belt. In other words, and then when they were going to launch Operation Dixie, initially they saw these unions playing a key role. Now, these unions were generally led by leftists who were also who understood very clearly that to successfully organize workers in the South would require a confrontation with Jim Crow. That there was no way to organize unions in the South and not take up segregation and disenfranchisement of African Americans. In fact, the successful unions had also done that. The ones that had succeeded before the 40s. Late 40s, you see the consolidation of the CIO bureaucracy and the purging of the left from the unions. And then Operation Dixie, they try to launch Operation Dixie, but they send down organizers who were basically saying, we will form unions, but we'll accept segregated locals. We will not challenge social segregation. We will not challenge disenfranchisement. And as a result, most of those campaigns failed. The result, and then we get Taft-Hartley, which allows for the states to pass right-to-work laws, etc. Now you're back into the situation here that you were in the, well, we're getting close to that same situation in the North, in the private sector, and if, things keep going the way they are in the public sector as well. But today the South looks very much like the Midwest did 30, 40 years ago, 50, 60 years ago. Lots. Growing factories, growing industrial sector, new working class, etc., but completely de-unionized.
Okay, we're pretty much at time because we gotta vacate this room. Thanks everybody for coming out. Don't forget we got Charlie's book here. If you want a copy of it, it's $20. Don't leave without one of these flyers for United Campus Workers, the local union here on campus. They're having an event on October 24th, just down the hall from here. So don't leave without a flyer. Don't leave without Solidarity's flyer. This is for our open